The studio lights are bright, the audience is energized, and the conversation is supposed to be fun. But sometimes, on live television, one question can completely change the tone of the room. What begins as a routine celebrity interview can shift in seconds into something tense, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. That is exactly what happened when Charli XCX sat across from Andy Cohen. The exchange was brief, but the reaction was immediate. The energy shifted, the smiles faded, and suddenly the conversation felt very different from what anyone expected. Before we dive into that moment, make sure you subscribe to Prime Talk, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. At first glance, the setup looked perfectly normal. Andy Cohen has built a reputation as one of the most recognizable talk show hosts in American television. As the longtime host of Watch What Happens Live, his interview style is known for being playful, direct, and occasionally provocative. The show thrives on spontaneity. Celebrities walk in expecting a mix of lighthearted games, fan questions, and the occasional surprising topic that pushes the conversation just a little further than a typical press interview. But that style also carries risk. Because the show is built around live broadcast energy, there are moments when questions land differently than expected. What might sound harmless in rehearsal can suddenly feel pointed when the cameras are rolling and the audience is watching in real time. And that night, the guest was someone who had built her entire career around authenticity and creative control. Charli XCX had already established herself as one of pop music's most unconventional voices. Known for her experimental approach to pop production and her unapologetically honest public persona, she had earned a loyal following. Her music blurred the lines between mainstream radio hits and underground pop innovation. Collaborations with artists across the industry had turned her into both a chart presence and a cultural tastemaker. But beyond the music, Charli had also become known for speaking her mind. She rarely filtered her opinions in interviews. Whether discussing the music industry, creative independence, or the pressures placed on female pop artists, she tended to answer questions directly. Fans appreciated that honesty. It made her feel real in an industry often filled with carefully crafted public images. By the time she appeared on Andy Cohen's show, Charli was already navigating a complex moment in her career. Her artistic direction had been evolving rapidly. She had experimented with new sounds, different collaborators, and a more avant-garde pop aesthetic. Critics were paying attention, and so were fans. That made the interview an interesting pairing from the start. Andy Cohen's show often sits at the intersection of entertainment gossip and celebrity conversation. The format encourages spontaneous discussion about headlines, rumors, and personal stories. Guests are expected to laugh, play along, and sometimes respond to questions they might not normally hear during a promotional interview. For many celebrities, that environment is part of the fun. But for others, especially artists who value control over their narrative, the unpredictability can create tension. When Charli XCX walked onto the set, the audience greeted her with applause. The atmosphere was upbeat, exactly what viewers of the show had come to expect. Andy Cohen welcomed her with his usual charm, opening the conversation with questions about her latest projects, her music, and the growing influence she had within pop culture. At first, everything seemed smooth. The conversation flowed naturally. They talked about her creative process, her fans, and the energy of performing live. Charli appeared relaxed, responding thoughtfully while maintaining the playful tone typical of the show. The audience laughed at a few jokes, and the interview seemed to be moving exactly as planned. But live television has a rhythm that can change quickly. Andy Cohen's interviews often move through different segments designed to keep viewers engaged. Some involve audience participation. Others feature rapid-fire questions or references to trending pop culture moments. It's a formula that usually works well because it keeps the conversation unpredictable. Still, unpredictability can sometimes create friction. Behind the scenes, talk shows operate under tight timing. Producers monitor the pace of the conversation. The host listens through an earpiece, and the show moves forward minute by minute. Guests rarely know exactly which question is coming next. That uncertainty is part of what makes the show exciting. But it can also be the moment when things shift. During Charli's appearance, the conversation gradually began moving away from the safer topics of music and touring. As the interview progressed, Andy Cohen started introducing questions that touched on broader industry conversations. The kind of questions that viewers often enjoy, but that sometimes make guests pause before answering. The audience didn't notice anything unusual yet. From their perspective, it was simply another segment of the show. Another moment where the host might bring up something unexpected. But as the questions continued, the tone of the conversation began to feel slightly more serious. Charli's responses became more measured. Her body language shifted subtly. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious enough to disrupt the show. But small signals started appearing, shorter answers, a pause before speaking, a glance toward the host that suggested she was carefully considering how to respond. Live interviews often contain those moments. Sometimes they pass quickly, disappearing into the natural flow of conversation. Other times, they build quietly until one specific question changes everything. What made this interview particularly interesting was the contrast between the show's casual atmosphere and the subject matter that was slowly emerging. The audience was still engaged, still expecting entertainment, but the conversation was drifting toward territory that felt slightly more personal. And then came the question. Not shouted, not dramatic, just a single line delivered the way Andy Cohen often delivers them. Casually, almost playfully. But the impact of that question was immediate. For a brief moment, the studio energy shifted. Charli XCX didn't respond right away. It was a pause that lasted only a few seconds, but on live television, even a short silence can feel much longer. The audience waited. Andy Cohen waited. And the cameras stayed locked on both of them, capturing every reaction. No edits. No cuts. Just two people sitting across from each other, and a conversation that suddenly felt far more complicated than anyone expected. What happened next would quickly become one of the most talked about moments from the interview. And once the conversation continued, it became clear that this was no longer just another celebrity appearance on a late-night talk show. By the time Charli XCX appeared on Andy Cohen's late-night talk show, she was already in a fascinating position within the pop music industry. Unlike many mainstream pop artists who follow predictable career paths, Charli had spent years navigating between commercial success and experimental creativity. Her early breakthrough introduced her to global audiences, but the path she chose afterward was far less conventional. Instead of simply repeating the formula that made her famous, she leaned into risk. She collaborated with producers, pushing the boundaries of pop music. She embraced futuristic sounds, digital aesthetics, and unconventional songwriting. And in doing so, she built a reputation not just as a singer, but as a creative force who constantly challenged the definition of mainstream pop. That creative independence came with a public image built on honesty. Charli rarely avoided difficult conversations about the music industry. In interviews, she often spoke openly about the pressures artists face, the expectations placed on female performers, and the complicated relationship between art and commercial success. Fans admired that directness. It made her interviews unpredictable, but also compelling. She was not the kind of guest who simply repeated promotional talking points. Meanwhile, Andy Cohen had built his entire television identity around asking the kinds of questions that other hosts might avoid. His show operates in a space between entertainment journalism and unscripted conversation. Celebrities come on to promote projects, but they also know the format encourages spontaneous discussions about headlines, rumors, and pop culture drama. The audience enjoys that unpredictability. Andy often mixes lighthearted games with pointed questions submitted by viewers. It creates an atmosphere that feels casual, but underneath that relaxed tone is a format designed to push conversations in unexpected directions. When producers invite a guest onto the show, they usually prepare a loose outline of topics. There are always planned questions connected to the guest's current work, but there is also flexibility built into the structure. Andy is known for responding in real time to audience reactions, social media chatter, and whatever energy the guest brings into the studio. That spontaneity is exactly what keeps viewers coming back. But it also means interviews can drift into uncomfortable territory if the guest and host approach a topic from different perspectives. In the weeks leading up to Charli's appearance, conversations about the direction of pop music were everywhere. Streaming platforms were reshaping the industry. Artists were experimenting with faster release cycles and unconventional marketing strategies. Charli herself had been part of that conversation because she embraced internet culture more aggressively than many of her peers. She interacted directly with fans online, teased music in unconventional ways, and collaborated with artists outside the traditional pop ecosystem. That approach earned her praise from critics who admired her willingness to challenge the industry's formula. At the same time, It occasionally placed her at the center of debates about authenticity, artistic experimentation, and the pressures of mainstream success. Interviews with Charli often touched on these themes because they were part of her public narrative. For a talk show host like Andy Cohen, that kind of narrative creates an opportunity. His audience enjoys hearing celebrities respond to real questions rather than rehearsed promotional answers. The show thrives when a guest speaks candidly about their experiences. And Charli's reputation for honesty made her a particularly interesting guest in that environment. Still, there is always a delicate balance during live television. A question that seems harmless in concept can suddenly feel more personal when the cameras are on and millions of viewers are watching. The host must keep the conversation entertaining. The guest must decide how much of themselves they want to reveal in that moment. As the interview progressed, Andy Cohen began guiding the conversation toward broader pop culture topics. This is a standard technique on the show. After discussing the guest's projects, Andy often pivots into questions about industry relationships, public perception, or moments that have generated online discussion. Sometimes those questions lead to funny stories. Other times they produce surprising reactions that become memorable clips after the broadcast. Charli initially responded comfortably. She laughed at a few remarks from Andy and engaged with the audience when they reacted to certain topics. Her answers remained thoughtful but relaxed. Viewers watching at home likely assumed the interview would continue in that same easygoing rhythm. However, subtle changes in tone can begin long before anyone realizes it. At one point in the conversation, Andy introduced a topic connected to how artists navigate public attention. It was not framed as a confrontation. In fact, the delivery was typical of his style, light, conversational, almost playful. But the subject itself required a more reflective answer. Instead of a quick response, Charli paused briefly before speaking. Her answer was measured and carefully phrased, suggesting she was choosing her words deliberately. Moments like that can change the emotional temperature of a live interview. When a guest begins responding more cautiously, the host has a decision to make. They can redirect the conversation back to lighter topics, or they can continue exploring the subject that prompted the shift. Andy Cohen's style often leans toward curiosity. If a guest hints at a deeper perspective, he tends to follow that thread. The audience in the studio was still enjoying the conversation. From their perspective, the discussion simply felt more thoughtful than comedic. But behind the scenes, producers and hosts are always aware of timing. Each segment moves quickly. There is little room for extended pauses or lengthy explanations. That pressure can sometimes make interviews feel faster than they actually are. Charli continued answering questions about her music and creative process. Yet there were small signals that the conversation was becoming more complex. Her tone grew slightly more serious. She occasionally leaned forward in her chair before responding, as if emphasizing the importance of what she was saying. None of this created tension by itself, but it did alter the rhythm of the exchange. Andy Cohen, known for keeping conversations lively, responded with another question designed to move things forward. This time the topic connected more directly to public perception of artists and the narratives that develop around them in media coverage. For someone like Charli, whose career had frequently been discussed in terms of innovation and industry expectations, it was a subject she had clearly thought about before. Her answer was thoughtful again, but it carried a sharper clarity than earlier responses. What started as a casual promotional appearance was slowly transforming into a conversation about larger ideas within the entertainment industry. Andy listened carefully and nodded as Charli spoke. The audience remained attentive, sensing the conversation was moving somewhere interesting. And then, as the segment continued, Andy leaned slightly forward and introduced another questie. What happened next would turn the interview into one of the most memorable live moments from that episode. The studio had been lively only moments earlier. Laughter had moved easily through the room, and the conversation between Charli XCX and Andy Cohen had followed the familiar rhythm viewers expected from the show. But when Andy introduced his next question, the tone changed almost immediately. He leaned slightly forward in his chair, holding his cue card loosely in one hand. His delivery was casual, the way he often presents questions that he knows might spark an interesting reaction. There was no dramatic buildup in his voice, no signal that this question was meant to disrupt the conversation. To the audience, it sounded like just another topic in the interview. But the subject touched directly on how artists are judged in the public eye. As the words left Andy's mouth, the camera cut to Charli XCX. She listened carefully, her expression calm but noticeably focused. For a brief moment, she did not speak. The silence lasted only a few seconds, yet on live television, even a short pause can stretch into something more noticeable. The audience grew quieter. Andy Cohen waited without interrupting. Hosts on live talk shows learn to recognize these moments. If a guest needs a second to process a question, the best approach is often patience. Jumping in too quickly can make the situation feel more awkward. Charli finally began to answer. Her voice was steady, but her tone was more deliberate than earlier in the interview. Instead of responding with a quick joke or an easy comment, she addressed the topic thoughtfully. She explained how artists often face assumptions about their intentions, especially when their work evolves in unexpected ways. The audience listened closely as she spoke. Andy nodded while she answered, maintaining eye contact. His posture suggested he was engaged and curious, but he did not interrupt. For a few moments, the conversation moved forward in a serious but respectful direction. Then Andy followed up. This time the question came faster, almost as a continuation of the previous point. It referenced the broader narrative surrounding artists who experiment with their sound and public image. In the world of pop music, those conversations often become heated online, with fans and critics debating whether certain choices represent artistic growth or calculated reinvention. Charli heard the follow-up and shifted slightly in her seat. Her shoulders moved back, and she took a breath before responding. Again, there was a brief pause. The audience could feel the tension building, even if the exchange remained polite. Live television amplifies every gesture. A pause, a glance, a change in tone, all of it becomes visible. When Charli answered, her words carried a clear sense of conviction. She spoke about the importance of creative freedom. She explained that artists should be allowed to explore new directions without constantly defending their motivations. Her explanation was calm, but it carried a firmness that suggested the subject mattered deeply to her. The audience responded with a small wave of applause. Andy Cohen smiled slightly, acknowledging the reaction. Moments like that are common on his show. When a guest says something that resonates with the audience, it often becomes a shared moment between the studio and the person speaking. But Andy wasn't finished. He introduced another question, this time referencing how public conversations about artists sometimes become shaped by headlines and social media commentary. The way he framed it sounded conversational, almost reflective. Yet the implication behind the question was clear. Public perception can influence how artists are discussed long before their work is fully understood. Charli listened again. This time, the pause that followed felt heavier. Her eyes moved briefly toward the audience before returning to Andy. The room remained quiet. Viewers watching at home could see the tension in the stillness between the two of them. When she spoke, her voice remained controlled, but her words were more direct. She acknowledged that public conversations often simplify complex creative decisions. She explained that musicians sometimes find themselves responding to narratives that form online, narratives that may not reflect the full reality of their work. Her tone suggested she had experienced that dynamic personally. Andy listened without interrupting. The cameras alternated between close shots of Charli speaking and wider shots of the studio audience, watching carefully. In the control room, producers monitored the pacing of the segment, aware that the conversation had moved far from the playful energy that opened the interview. Yet that shift was exactly what made the moment compelling. Andy leaned back slightly before asking another question. His delivery remained calm, but the topic circled once again around how artists navigate criticism and expectations. This time the question was more pointed, though still framed politely. Charli reacted instantly. Instead of pausing as long as before, she responded quickly, as if the subject had finally reached the point where she wanted to clarify her perspective fully. Her explanation was thoughtful but noticeably more passionate than earlier responses. She spoke about how artists often feel pressure to explain every creative choice. She emphasized that experimentation is part of the artistic process, and that audiences sometimes misunderstand the risks involved in creating something new. The audience remained silent while she spoke, listening closely. Andy nodded again, but the energy between them had clearly changed. What began as a typical late-night interview had turned into a more serious conversation about art, perception, and the pressures surrounding fame. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The pause felt longer this time. The audience shifted slightly in their seats. Somewhere in the background, A faint sound from the studio equipment reminded everyone that this was still a live broadcast unfolding in real time. Andy eventually smiled and responded with a brief acknowledgement of Charli's point. His tone softened, signaling that he recognized the seriousness of the discussion. Rather than pushing the topic further, he transitioned gently toward the next segment of the show. The shift came quickly. Music cues played softly as the conversation moved on, and the audience clapped, relieved to feel the atmosphere returning to the lighter rhythm typical of the program. But the moment that had just occurred lingered in the room. For viewers watching live, it was clear something unusual had happened. Nothing explosive. No raised voices. No dramatic confrontation. Yet the exchange had revealed the delicate balance between host and guest on live television. A single line of questioning had transformed the energy of the interview, if only for a few minutes. And because the moment unfolded without edits, every pause, every glance, every carefully chosen word had been visible to the audience. By the time the segment ended, the conversation had already begun circulating online. Viewers replayed the clip, analyzing the subtle shifts in tone and body language that made the exchange feel so tense. But what happened after the cameras moved on to the next segment would prove just as interesting as the moment itself. As the conversation shifted to the next segment of the show, the energy in the studio slowly began to recover. The audience responded to the change in pace with polite applause, and the music cues helped guide the broadcast back toward the familiar rhythm of late-night television. But the moment that had just unfolded between Charli XCX and Andy Cohen still lingered in the room. Live television moves quickly. Producers are constantly monitoring the clock, making sure each segment fits into its scheduled time. There is rarely an opportunity to pause and analyze what just happened. The show must keep going. New topics appear, games are introduced, and the host guides the audience forward. Yet anyone paying close attention could sense that something had shifted. Andy Cohen handled the transition with the professionalism he has developed over years of hosting live broadcasts. His tone remained upbeat, and he introduced the next portion of the show without drawing further attention to the tension that had briefly surfaced. That ability to redirect the atmosphere is one of the most important skills a live host can have. For Charli XCX, the shift back to lighter conversation allowed the moment to settle. She participated in the remainder of the segment with composure, answering questions and interacting with the audience as the show continued. From a viewer's perspective, the broadcast returned to its typical format. But the earlier exchange had already created a moment that viewers would remember long after the episode ended. When the cameras eventually stopped rolling, the conversation did not simply disappear. Clips from the interview began circulating online almost immediately. In the era of digital media, live television moments rarely remain confined to the broadcast itself. Short excerpts travel across social platforms, where viewers replay them, analyze them, and share their interpretations. The moment between Charli XCX and Andy Cohen quickly became one of those clips. Some viewers focused on the silence that followed Andy's question. Others discussed the way Charli framed her response about artistic freedom and public perception. The exchange was subtle, but its authenticity made it compelling. It was not a scripted confrontation. It was simply a real conversation unfolding under the pressure of live television. Media outlets covering entertainment news also noticed the moment. Talk show interviews often produce memorable quotes, but they rarely generate discussion about the dynamics of the conversation itself. In this case, however, the tone of the exchange invited closer attention. Writers analyzing the clip pointed out how Charli maintained a calm but firm perspective when discussing creative independence. For fans of Charli XCX, the moment reinforced something they had already admired about her. Throughout her career, she had consistently spoken about the importance of experimentation in music. Her willingness to explore new sounds and collaborate with unconventional producers had shaped her reputation as an artist who valued creativity over predictability. The interview moment on Andy Cohen's show reflected that same philosophy. Instead of avoiding a complex topic, she addressed it directly. At the same time, the exchange also demonstrated the role hosts like Andy Cohen play in modern television. His style often invites guests to speak more openly than they might during a traditional promotional appearance. That openness can lead to laughter and viral moments, but it can also reveal deeper conversations about the realities of the entertainment industry. The balance between those outcomes is what makes live interviews so unpredictable. In the days following the broadcast, viewers continued sharing the clip. Some interpreted the pause in the conversation as tension, while others viewed it simply as a thoughtful response to a serious question. The range of reactions illustrated how live television allows audiences to experience a moment from different perspectives. What everyone agreed on, however, was that the exchange felt genuine. There were no edits smoothing out the pauses, no retakes adjusting the pacing. Every reaction occurred in real time, exactly as it happened in the studio. In an era when many media appearances are carefully managed, that authenticity stood out. For Charli XCX, the moment did not dramatically alter the trajectory of her career. She continued releasing music, collaborating with other artists, and pushing the boundaries of pop production. Interviews following the appearance still reflected the same candid personality that had drawn fans to her in the first place. If anything, the moment reinforced her image as someone willing to engage seriously with questions about creativity and public perception. For Andy Cohen and his show, the interview represented another example of how live television can produce unexpected moments that resonate beyond the broadcast itself. The format of his program thrives on spontaneity. Sometimes that spontaneity leads to hilarious exchanges between celebrities. Other times it opens the door to more thoughtful conversations about the pressures surrounding fame and artistic expression. In this case, it did both. What began as a routine promotional interview gradually transformed into a moment that revealed the complexities behind the public image of a pop artist. The shift happened quietly, through pauses and carefully chosen words rather than dramatic confrontation. And that is precisely why viewers remembered it. Moments like this remind audiences that behind every headline and every viral clip are real conversations taking place between people navigating the unpredictable world of live television. A single question, delivered at the right moment, can reveal far more than anyone anticipated. Even when the show moves on, those moments remain. If you enjoy exploring these unforgettable live TV encounters where celebrities are caught off guard and real conversations unfold on air, subscribe to Prime Talk, like this video, share it with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments below.